The barrel sits at exactly the right angle, 23 degrees of depression, covering a frozen ditch that any attacker must cross to reach the tree line. The MG-42 rests on its Lafette tripod, the traverse and elevation wheels locked, the ammunition belt threaded through the feed tray with the first round seated. Someone did everything correctly. The position itself tells you that. A meter-deep emplacement cut into the frozen earth, log reinforcement against artillery fragments, a second belt coiled in a metal box within arm's reach, 300 rounds ready, 600 more in the covered pit behind. The gun faces west, toward the American lines, and the interlocking fields of fire with the position 80 meters to the right would create a wall of 1,200 rounds per minute across that open ground. It never fired once. January 19th, 1945. The Colmar Pocket, that bulge of German-held territory west of the Rhine that refused to collapse when the rest of Alsace fell. The Wehrmacht held it through December, through the opening weeks of January, and the defensive positions looked exactly like this one. Carefully sighted, properly supplied. Technically perfect for the daylight attack that doctrine said the Americans would deliver. The Americans came at 0300 hours, through the snow, in the dark, and by the time the crew realized what was happening, the muzzle of an M1 Garand was 3 feet from the assistant gunner's face. The gun was captured unfired because the men behind it never saw the Americans coming. Not because they were asleep. The record suggests they were awake, alert, watching the approaches their position was designed to cover. They simply could not see what was invisible. American infantry moving through 18 inches of fresh snow, in white camouflage they had improvised from bedsheets and parachute silk, without artillery preparation, without tank support, without any of the signatures German defenders had been trained to detect. That should not have worked. German doctrine emphasized exactly this kind of prepared defense. The MG-42 was the backbone of it, the weapon around which entire squad tactics were built. American infantry was supposed to advance in daylight, preceded by artillery, channeled by terrain into those interlocking kill zones. The mathematics were simple. 1,200 rounds per minute, times 2 guns, times 60 seconds of engagement, equals enough metal in the air to stop any assault cold. The mathematics assumed you could see what you were shooting at. If you served in the infantry, Korea, Vietnam, the sandbox, anywhere, drop it in the comments, unit, years, theater, or write it for someone who can't. Like this video, so other veterans find it. Subscribe if you want more of the real history they didn't teach you. What happened at that position in the Colmar Pocket was not a fluke, it was a pattern. Across the pocket in January and February of 1945, German positions that should have held, positions with adequate ammunition, adequate manning, adequate fields of fire, fell to American infantry, who arrived without warning in the dark and the cold. The defenders did not panic. They did not run. They simply never got the chance to fight. The German after-action reports use a phrase that appears over and over, without any preparation. American attacks came without artillery or armor noise, without the buildup of men and materiel that German observers had learned to watch for. One report describes a company command post that changed hands before the telephone operator could complete a single call. Another mentions a mortar position captured with all tubes ready to fire, crews standing by, no idea the Americans were within 500 meters until they were within 50. The MG-42 in its frozen emplacement represents something the German army was not prepared to face. Not new weapons, or overwhelming numbers, or air superiority. Not tank formations, or the famous American artillery. Something quieter. Something that made all those advantages irrelevant because it operated below the threshold of detection. Night assault doctrine. The American Army of January 1945 was not the army that had stumbled through North Africa in 42. It was not the army that had learned hard lessons in the hedgerows of Normandy. By the time the Colmar Pocket needed to be eliminated, American infantry had developed something that their German counterparts simply did not believe was possible: the ability to move battalion-strength forces through defended terrain in total darkness without losing unit cohesion. The gun that never fired tells you what that capability was worth. Position, sighting, ammunition supply, all perfect. None of it mattered, because the crew could not engage what they could not perceive. To understand how the American infantry developed this capability, and why the Germans never managed to counter it, we have to go back to a training revolution that started 18 months earlier and 6,000 miles away. Why did the Germans build their entire defensive system around an assumption that seemed so obvious it never needed stating? Because for 4 years, the assumption held. The Wehrmacht's defensive doctrine was not improvised. It evolved through hard experience on the Eastern Front, where Soviet mass attacks taught German commanders exactly what worked. The answer was layered fires, artillery, mortars, machine guns, rifles, all registered on predetermined points that funneled attackers into kill zones. The system required coordination. Coordination required communication. Communication required observation. And observation required light. Start with the MG-42 positions. The Lafette tripod mount allowed the gunner to lock traverse and elevation stops, creating a fixed cone of fire that covered exactly the terrain it needed to cover. During daylight, a single observer, often positioned higher or to the flank, could call adjustments, shift fire left, shift fire right, concentrate on that tree line. The gun responded, but the system assumed that observer could see targets to call those adjustments. In total darkness, the traverse locks became a limitation. The gun fired where it was pointed. If the attack came from another direction, or from closer than the beaten zone, the crew had to unlock, re-aim, relock. Seconds mattered. In the dark, they did not have seconds. The artillery worked the same way. German defensive fires were pre-registered, meaning forward observers had already calculated the coordinates for likely avenues of approach. When Americans appeared at point A, the observer called for concentration 7. The guns fired. Shells landed on point A. Beautiful system. The reports from the Colmar fighting describe it failing repeatedly because by the time observers spotted American infantry in the dark, the infantry was too close for artillery to engage without hitting German positions. One battery commander wrote that his guns remained silent through an entire American assault because no observer ever reported a target they could range. Mortars had the same problem. The 81mm and 120mm mortars that gave German defenses their flexibility needed spotters to adjust fire. In daylight, a mortar team could walk rounds onto a target in 3 or 4 adjustments. In darkness, they fired blind, or did not fire at all. The illumination system was supposed to solve this. German doctrine called for flare guns at company level and parachute flares from mortars at battalion level. The idea was simple. If attackers came at night, you lit them up. The magnesium flares burned bright enough to turn midnight into noon for 30 or 40 seconds. Plenty of time to acquire targets and open fire. The flaw was timing. Flares worked when you knew the attack was coming. A sentry spots movement, fires a flare, the defensive system wakes up. But American night assault doctrine eliminated the sentry as a warning system. The approach was so quiet. No vehicles, no artillery preparation, no radio chatter, no shouted commands, that sentries did not know to fire illumination until Americans were already inside the wire. At that point, flares helped no one. The melee was too close for supporting fires, and the bright light blinded defenders whose eyes had adjusted to darkness. German defensive positions also depended on telephone lines, connecting forward outposts to company and battalion command. The wires ran along the ground, or a few inches beneath it, vulnerable to artillery, but protected enough for normal operations. American patrols learned to find and cut those wires before the main assault. One report from the 3rd Infantry Division describes a patrol that spent 40 minutes in the dark tracing telephone wire from a listening post back toward the German main line, cutting it at 3 separate points. When the assault came, the listening post could not warn anyone. The battalion command post learned about the American attack when an American sergeant walked through the door. The German system was a machine. Every component depended on every other component. Observers fed artillery and mortars. Machine guns covered the gaps. Illumination bought time. Communications held it together. In daylight, the machine killed with industrial efficiency. The Americans had learned that in Normandy, in the Hürtgen Forest, in a dozen bloody fights where German defensive fires turned open ground into graveyards. But the machine had an off switch. Darkness degraded observation. Degraded observation eliminated fire adjustment. Eliminated adjustment meant artillery and mortars fired on coordinates that might or might not contain Americans. Illumination depended on warning that never came. Communications failed when wires were cut and radios stayed silent. The MG-42 positions, so lethal in daylight, became fixed guns pointing at empty ground, while attackers approached from angles the gunners could not see. The Germans understood this vulnerability. They were not fools, but they believed, with considerable historical justification, that no army could conduct coordinated attacks in total darkness at scale. Small patrols, yes, raids against isolated positions certainly, but battalion-strength assaults through defended terrain without losing unit cohesion. That was impossible. The Americans made it possible. The Vosges Mountains rise to the west. The Rhine flows to the east. Between them, 50 kilometers of Alsatian plain, frozen farmland, scattered villages with stone walls and tile roofs, vineyard rows that disappeared under January snow. This was the Colmar Pocket in the 3rd week of 1945, a bulge of German-held territory that should have collapsed in November and refused to. General Siegfried Rasp commanded the 19th Army defending it. His forces were a patchwork, remnants of divisions that had retreated through France, Volksgrenadier units filled with men too old or too young for frontline service, a scattering of Waffen-SS formations with better equipment and worse discipline. On paper, it looked weak. On the ground, it looked like a killing field. The defensive logic was simple. Any American attack had to cross open terrain. The snow made concealment impossible. Dark figures against white ground, visible for hundreds of meters. The cold made rapid movement exhausting. Infantry wading through knee-deep drifts would arrive at German positions tired, frozen, and bunched together by the paths of least resistance. The MG-42 crews knew those paths. They had ranged them. They had laid wire along the approaches they could not cover directly. They had buried mines at the obvious crossing points. Temperature records from Colmar show the average low in January 1945 at -8 Celsius. That is 17 degrees Fahrenheit. Rifle mechanisms froze. Men's breath created visible clouds even at rest. Bare metal took skin from anyone who touched it. The Germans had dealt with cold before. The Eastern Front had taught them how. Insulated bunkers, rotation schedules to prevent frostbite, weapons cleaned with graphite lubricant instead of oil. The 19th Army knew how to fight in winter, and winter, they believed, was their ally. American forces surrounding the pocket had the opposite problem. They were attacking, not defending. They could not rotate men through warm bunkers. They could not wait for spring. The Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, had pulled reserves north, and Eisenhower needed the Colmar Pocket eliminated before those reserves could return to their planned operations. The Americans had to attack, soon, across open ground. Into prepared defenses. Rasp knew the numbers, 6 divisions roughly, spread thin, but holding terrain that multiplied their effectiveness. The villages offered strong points, stone walls that stopped rifle fire, cellars that survived artillery. The open fields between villages offered kill zones. The frozen canals that crisscrossed the plain forced attackers into predictable crossing points. Every advantage belonged to the defense. One advantage above all: time. The longer the pocket held, the more resources it tied down. Every American division facing Colmar was a division not crossing the Rhine. Every artillery battery firing at German positions in Alsace was a battery not supporting operations in the Rhineland. The pocket did not need to win. It needed to bleed. The first American attacks confirmed German confidence. January 20th, the 36th Infantry Division attacked toward Benwehr. Daylight assault, standard doctrine, artillery preparation followed by infantry advance. German defensive fires caught the lead companies in the open. One battalion lost 140 men before reaching the first objective. Another stalled completely, pinned by machine gun fire from positions that had survived the bombardment. This was supposed to happen. This was what German defensive doctrine was designed to produce. The regimental commander, watching from his command post, saw exactly what he expected to see. American infantry struggling across frozen ground, channeled by terrain, destroyed by fires they could not suppress. The system worked for one more day. What the German commander could not see was what happened after dark. While his men reoccupied positions abandoned during the bombardment, while they cleared frozen weapons and redistributed ammunition, while they reported to higher headquarters that the American attack had been repulsed, American infantry was already moving. They moved without daylight, without artillery preparation, avoiding the avenues of approach that German observers had watched all day. The second attack came at 02:30 on January 21st. No preparation, no warning. Americans materialized out of the darkness wearing white sheets over their uniforms. faces blackened, weapons taped to prevent metallic sounds. They moved through the snow like ghosts, slowly, deliberately, in formations that made no sense to anyone watching for a conventional assault. Listening posts never reported contact. The telephone wires had been cut hours earlier. Flares stayed in their canisters because no one knew to fire them. By dawn, 3 German company command posts had changed hands. The strong point at Benwehr, the one that had shattered the daylight attack, was surrounded. Its garrison surrendered before noon because resupply had become impossible and relief was not coming. The pocket was still there, but something had changed. The assumptions that made it defensible, the certainty that attackers would be visible, noisy, predictable, those assumptions were dying in the frozen dark. The American army learned night warfare because daylight warfare was killing it. That sounds obvious now. It was not obvious in the summer of 1944, when American infantry doctrine still assumed that firepower superiority would compensate for tactical exposure. The theory went like this: American artillery was better. American air support was overwhelming. American logistics could sustain operations that exhausted any defender. Therefore, American infantry could attack during the day because the Germans would be too suppressed to resist effectively. The hedgerows of Normandy destroyed that theory in 6 weeks. The bocage, those ancient field boundaries of earth and dense vegetation, created perfect defensive terrain. German machine gun positions sat invisible behind hedgerow walls. American infantry crossing the open fields between hedgerows moved in full view of defenders who remained invisible, impossible to suppress, impossible to flank, without exposing more men to more fire. Artillery helped. Air support helped when weather permitted. Neither helped enough. The 29th Infantry Division lost over 2,000 men in the first 3 weeks after D-Day. The 4th Infantry Division lost nearly as many. Entire rifle companies were rebuilt twice, 3 times, with replacements who arrived on Tuesday and died on Thursday. The survivors learned. They had no choice. The first adaptation was simple: stop crossing open ground in daylight. Patrols mapped German positions at night. Engineers blew gaps in hedgerows at night. The actual assault still happened at dawn, first light, when Americans could see but German eyes had not adjusted. But the preparation happened in darkness. Casualty rates dropped. Progress accelerated. By late July, the bocage was behind them. Then came the Hürtgen Forest. The Hürtgen made the hedgerows look like a training exercise. Dense pine forest, steep ravines, fortified villages, and German defenders who had spent months preparing positions that American artillery could not find and American aircraft could not see. The 1st Infantry Division attacked in October, the 4th in November. The 28th attacked and was effectively destroyed. 4,000 casualties in 2 weeks, including 1 regiment that lost 90% of its officers. Daylight assaults into prepared defenses. The formula that had failed in the hedgerows, repeated at scale with predictable results. The after-action reports from the Hürtgen are brutal reading. Unit commanders describe attacks where every man knew he was walking into fire he could not suppress, artillery preparations that churned empty forest while German troops waited in bunkers, machine gun positions that the maps said were destroyed and the casualty lists proved were not. Something had to change. The change came from multiple directions at once. Division training officers had studied British night fighting techniques in the Mediterranean. At the battalion level, commanders had improvised night movements to avoid the worst of the artillery. Individual soldiers had discovered that German sentries could not see them if they moved slowly enough. The knowledge existed in fragments across the army. What happened in late 1944 was consolidation. Taped weapons, every piece of metal that might clink against another piece wrapped in friction tape or cloth. Single-file movement along predetermined lanes marked by white tape or engineer string. Compass bearings memorized by squad leaders, checked every 50 meters. Hand signals only. No voice commands, no whistles, no anything that carried sound. The final 100 yards covered at a crawl, one man moving while 9 stayed motionless, the approach taking 40 minutes for a distance that daylight doctrine crossed in two. This was not how American infantry had trained. The doctrine manuals emphasized speed, violence of action, the shock effect of massed fire. Night infiltration was the opposite, slow, silent, patient. It demanded a different kind of discipline, a trust that the man ahead of you knew where he was going, an acceptance that you might crawl past a German position close enough to smell cigarette smoke and do nothing about it, because the mission was penetration, not engagement. The training happened in rear areas during December and January. Units rotating off the line spent 3 days, 5 days, a week practicing movement in darkness. They learned to recognize the sound of their own breathing and suppress it. Snow, they discovered, squeaked underfoot at certain temperatures and not at others. White camouflage meant nothing if you cast a shadow against it. By the time those units reached the Colmar Pocket, they were not the same formations that had bled in the Hürtgen. Same men, many of them. Same equipment, different capabilities. The Germans facing them did not know this. Their intelligence assessments still described American infantry as dependent on artillery and air support, reluctant to close with defenders, predictable in their approach routes. Those assessments were accurate for the American army of 6 months earlier. The army attacking in January 1945 had evolved. The assessments had not. The gap between German expectations and American capabilities was about to become a slaughter. The lead scout stops. Behind him, 47 men freeze mid-stride, some with one boot still lifted from the snow. No signal passes down the line. The halt propagates by feel, by the absence of movement ahead, by the discipline beaten into them during those December training nights when sergeants threw pebbles at anyone who made noise. The scout holds position for 11 seconds, 12. Then, his silhouette shifts forward again, and the column follows. This is Fox Company, 3rd Infantry Division, moving toward a German strongpoint 300 meters ahead. The temperature sits at -12°C. The snow reaches mid-thigh in the drifts, knee-deep on the packed crust between them. Every step requires lifting the boot clear, placing it forward, pressing down slowly to test for ice that might crack or brush that might snap. A fast man covers 50 meters in 10 minutes. Fox Company has been moving for 2 hours and crossed maybe 600 meters. The cold does strange things. Fingers lose sensation first. The men discovered this in training, learned to flex their hands inside mittens every few minutes, squeezing blood back into tissue that wanted to die. Toes go next. The Army issue boots were not designed for this, and every man in the column, knows at least one soldier who lost feet to frostbite in the Ardennes. Noses run constantly. The men learn to wipe with the backs of their mittens, silently, because sniffing created sound that carried in frozen air. One private in the 3rd Squad breathes through a wool scarf wrapped around his face. His lungs cannot handle the raw cold without it, and the medic cleared him for the mission anyway, because they needed bodies. The German position shows no light, no sound. The defensive works exist as a darker mass against the snow, barely visible even from 200 meters. The MG-42 that commands this approach points southeast, toward the road the Americans use for their daylight attack. The crew sleeps in a dugout 30 feet behind the gun, standard rotation, 2 hours on, 4 hours off, the men too cold to maintain continuous watch. Fox Company approaches from the northeast. The wire comes first. Not the heavy concertina that block the main approaches, but a single strand of tripwire connected to flare canisters. The lead scout finds it by touch. His hands sweep the snow ahead of him in slow arcs, feeling for exactly this. He traces the wire left, finds the canister, disarms it by cutting the firing cord with wire cutters that he warmed against his body for an hour before the mission. Cold metal makes noise, warm metal does not. Behind him, the column waits. Some men kneel in the snow. Others stand motionless, conserving the energy they will need when the assault begins. No one speaks, no one coughs. One soldier feels the urge to sneeze building in his sinuses. He pinches his nose hard, forces the pressure down, swallows it. A sneeze carries 300 meters on a still night. He learned this in training, when a sergeant made the entire platoon low crawl an extra mile because one man could not control his sinuses. The scout moves forward again. The column follows. At 75 meters, they can smell the Germans. Wood smoke from a stove somewhere behind the line. Something cooking. Cabbage, maybe, or turnips. The smell means warmth, and men who think they are safe. One American soldier later described the experience as walking up to a house where dinner was being prepared and knowing you were about to kill everyone inside. At 50 meters, they hear voices, low conversation from the dugout where the machine gun crew sleeps. The words are indistinct, German, obviously, but too quiet to make out content. Someone laughs. The sound cuts off quickly, as if the man remembered where he was. The assault element splits. 2 squads move left, toward the dugout. 1 squad moves right, toward the gun position. The movement takes another 15 minutes. 15 minutes of crawling through snow that soaks through every layer of clothing and packs into rifle actions despite the tape, numbing hands until the men cannot feel their own triggers. The signal is a white flare from the company commander, positioned 200 meters behind the assault element. When it goes up, the attack begins. Until then, silence. The Germans in the dugout finish their conversation. Someone settles into sleep. The Americans hear the creak of a wooden frame, the rustle of blankets. The machine gun position stays unmanned. The sentry, who should be watching the northeast approach, is urinating against a tree 40 meters from his post, his rifle leaning against the trunk because he needed both hands to work frozen buttons. Fox Company waits in the snow, 50 meters from men who do not know they are there. Fingers on triggers they cannot feel, eyes fixed on positions they can barely see. The flare arcs into the sky at 0317, 0347. The flare has been burning for 30 seconds. In that half minute, Fox Company covered the final 50 meters at a dead sprint. Men who could barely feel their legs churning through snow that grabbed at every stride, rifles coming up, voices finally unleashed after 3 hours of enforced silence. The first American reaches the dugout entrance before the first German exits it. What happens next takes 11 seconds. The after-action report describes it in clinical language. Dugout secured, enemy personnel neutralized, no friendly casualties. What actually happened was messier. A corporal from Pittsburgh shoved his rifle barrel through the dugout's blanket door and fired twice into darkness. Someone screamed. Someone else tried to push past the blanket and caught a bayonet in the chest. A private threw a fragmentation grenade through a firing slit in the bunker's rear wall. The explosion in that confined space killed 3 men and deafened a 4th, who survived only because he had been crouching in the far corner. The machine gun crew died in their blankets. They never reached the gun. The MG-42 that had been positioned to slaughter any daylight assault sat unmanned, its barrel still pointed at a killing ground that no longer mattered. 30 meters to the east, the second squad hit the communication trench. Germans stumbled out of a shelter, half-dressed, grabbing for weapons they could not find in the dark. One man raised his hands immediately. He had been a postal clerk in Munich before the war and had no intention of dying for a position that was already lost. Another tried to run and made it 6 steps before rifle fire cut his legs from under him. He lay in the snow screaming until someone put a round through his head. The screaming stopped. The sentry, the one who had been urinating against a tree, heard the shooting and ran toward his rifle. An American private intercepted him. The German was 19 years old. The American was 22. Neither spoke the other's language. The German raised his hands. The American gestured with his rifle barrel. Move. The German moved. By 0351, the position belonged to Fox Company. The German battalion commander learned about the loss at 0415, when his telephone line to the strongpoint went dead and runners sent to investigate did not return. His response followed doctrine: alert the reserve platoon, prepare a counterattack, restore the position before dawn. Standard procedure. He had done this before, on the Eastern Front, when Soviet infiltrators occasionally broke through outpost lines. The counterattack stepped off at 0530. 2 platoons, maybe 60 men, advancing toward a position they expected to find lightly held by exhausted Americans who had just completed a difficult approach march. Fox Company spent the intervening hour turning the position around. Ammunition redistributed. The captured MG-42 repositioned to cover the likely counterattack route. The Germans' own trip flares strung across the eastern approaches. The Americans were no longer attacking. They were defending. And they were defending with every advantage the Germans had enjoyed 12 hours earlier. Prepared positions, knowledge of terrain, weapons already ranged on the avenues of approach. The German counterattack walked into its own defensive plan. The flares went up at 0542. German infantry, silhouetted against the snow, suddenly visible for hundreds of meters. The MG-42 opened fire. The same gun that should have killed Americans crossing the same ground, now killing Germans attempting to retake it. One German NCO, captured that morning, described the experience in terms that the interrogator flagged as significant. He said his unit had trained for years to defend against exactly the kind of attack they had just attempted. They knew how to kill men crossing open ground toward prepared positions. They had done it dozens of times on the Eastern Front. What they had never trained for was the possibility that the enemy might already be inside the wire when the fighting started. The position that was supposed to bleed American divisions for weeks fell in under an hour. The counterattack that was supposed to restore it cost the Germans 43 dead and 19 captured. Fox Company's casualties: 7 wounded, 2 killed. One of the dead was the corporal from Pittsburgh. A stray round caught him during the counterattack while he was feeding ammunition to the captured machine gun. The Colmar Pocket held for 3 more weeks. Village by village, strong point by strong point, the pattern repeated. Daylight attacks failed. Night infiltrations succeeded. German commanders reported the same thing over and over. Positions overrun before the garrison could respond. Defenses neutralized from within. The entire logic of prepared fortifications, inverted by an enemy who refused to attack the way enemies were supposed to attack. The system that was supposed to bleed had started hemorrhaging. Feldwebel Heinrich Brenner opens his eyes to a rifle barrel 6 inches from his face. The American holding it says nothing, just watches. Behind him, another American is going through Brenner's kit bag, tossing aside socks and a photograph and a letter from his sister in Cologne. The dugout smells like cordite and something else. Blood, Brenner realizes, from the man who had been sleeping on the bunk across from him and is now slumped against the wall with a hole in his chest. Brenner does not reach for his pistol. He does not move at all. The American's finger rests on the trigger, and there is nothing in his expression that suggests he would hesitate to use it. This was not supposed to happen. Brenner had served at Kursk. He had survived the retreat from Kharkov, the fighting withdrawal across Ukraine, the desperate defense of the Vistula crossings. He understood defensive warfare the way a carpenter understands wood grain, intuitively, completely. Positions channeled attackers into kill zones. Artillery registered on the approaches. Overlapping fields of fire closed every gap so that any advance through one zone exposed the attacker to fire from 3 directions simultaneously. The Americans were standing in his dugout. The defensive system that was supposed to stop them existed in perfect form outside. The machine gun emplacements, the pre-surveyed artillery targets, the communication trenches that allowed rapid reinforcement, all of it intact, none of it engaged. The Americans had walked through it like it was not there, because by the time they became visible, they were already inside. Brenner raised his hand slowly. The American with the rifle gestured toward the dugout entrance. "Get up, move." Outside, the snow glowed faintly in the pre-dawn dark. Other Germans knelt in a line near the communication trench, their hands on their heads, guarded by Americans who looked tired and cold and utterly unsurprised by what they had accomplished. The MG-42 position sat empty. The crew that should have been manning it lay in the snow nearby, covered by a tarp that did not quite hide the blood staining the white fabric. Brenner counted 11 other prisoners, 11 out of a garrison of 34. The math told him what had happened to the rest. A German officer, Lieutenant somebody, Brenner did not recognize him, was arguing with an American sergeant. The argument was pointless. The American did not speak German. The lieutenant's English consisted of phrases he had learned from captured British soldiers in North Africa. Neither understood the other. The lieutenant kept gesturing toward the east, toward where the battalion headquarters lay, as if explaining the situation would somehow change it. The American sergeant eventually shrugged and walked away. The lieutenant stood there, his hands still raised, his mouth still moving, explaining to no one. This was how it ended. Not in a battle, not in a heroic last stand, not in any of the ways the propaganda films suggested it would end. It ended with men kneeling in snow, their weapons stacked against a wall they had built to protect them, their defenses rendered meaningless by an enemy who had simply refused to cooperate with the plan. One of the prisoners, a corporal who had been on sentry duty, kept saying the same thing over and over. The interrogator's notes describe it as a statement of disbelief repeated at least 8 times. He said they came from nowhere. They were just there. I was watching the road. I was watching the road the whole time. Nobody came down the road. He was right. Nobody had come down the road. The Americans came through the forest, through the snow, through the gaps between observation posts at 3 a.m, when sentries were cold and tired and watching the obvious approaches, so slowly that their movement was invisible, so quietly that their approach made no sound. By the time they became a threat, they were already inside the perimeter. The defensive system was not flawed. The defensive system was perfect for an enemy who attacked the way enemies had always attacked. The Americans had simply stopped being that enemy. Brenner stood in the snow with his hands on his head and watched the Americans consolidate the position. They moved with professional efficiency, redistributing ammunition, repositioning the captured machine gun, stringing wire across the approaches from the east, clearing fields of fire toward the battalion headquarters. They were not resting, they were preparing. He understood what came next. The battalion would counterattack. Doctrine demanded it. And when that counterattack came, it would hit a position that was now defended by Americans using German weapons, German fortifications, German registered fire points. The elaborate system that was supposed to bleed the enemy would bleed Germans instead. Brenner had built positions like this across 2 continents. He knew exactly how lethal they were from the attacker's perspective. The sun would rise in 2 hours. By then, the counterattack would have failed, and the Americans would be pushing toward the next strong point. The pocket that was supposed to hold until spring would collapse in weeks. The system had worked perfectly. It just worked for the wrong side. The German army that had conquered Europe in daylight learned to fear American infantry after dark. This is not interpretation. The Foreign Military Studies collection contains dozens of post-war reports from German officers attempting to explain what went wrong in the final year of the war. The assessments of American artillery are grudging but consistent, effective, overwhelming, impossible to match. The assessments of American air power acknowledge superiority without enthusiasm. But the assessments of American night operations carry a different tone, something closer to confusion. One general officer, writing for the U.S. Army Historical Division in 1947, devoted 11 pages to the problem. His unit had faced American forces in the Vosges and the Colmar Pocket. What he described was a systematic failure of German defensive assumptions. Positions that should have held for days fell in hours. Garrisons that should have inflicted catastrophic casualties were themselves destroyed before they could engage. The night, he wrote, belonged to the American infantry, and we never found an answer. The Colmar Pocket collapsed on February 9, 1945. 3 weeks of fighting, 17,000 German prisoners. The defensive system that was supposed to bleed American divisions into ineffectiveness instead hemorrhaged German strength until nothing remained worth defending. The 19th Army, which had held the pocket since November, ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Fox companies survived, most of them. The 7 wounded from the Strong Point assault evacuated to field hospitals in the rear, where surgeons worked under canvas in temperatures that froze the blood on their instruments. 2 men lost fingers to frostbite, not from the night approach, but from the hours spent defending the captured position while waiting for relief. The cold did not care whose side you were on. The corporal from Pittsburgh was buried in a temporary cemetery near Colmar. His grave marker listed name, rank, serial number, date of death. The Army would move him twice more before he reached his final resting place in 1948. His family received a telegram first, then a letter. Finally, a medal he had earned by firing a captured machine gun at the men who had built the position around it. Brenner, the Feldwebel who woke to a rifle barrel 6 inches from his face, spent the rest of the war in a prisoner camp in Oklahoma. He worked on a farm outside Tulsa, picking cotton alongside men who had fought at Stalingrad and El Alamein, and a dozen other places that now existed only in memory. The farmer who employed them said they were good workers, quiet, polite, happy to be alive. The American private who had pointed that rifle at Brenner's face, his name appears nowhere in the records. The after-action report does not mention him, nor does the unit roster, nor any surviving document. He was one of 47 men who crossed 600 meters of frozen ground in 3 hours without making a sound, and then killed or captured 34 enemy soldiers in under an hour, and then held the position against a counterattack that outnumbered them nearly 2 to 1. His contribution to the war effort was measured in German bodies and captured weapons and ground taken. His name was not considered worth recording. The training that made the operation possible continued after the war. The night infiltration techniques developed in the forests of Georgia and the deserts of California became standard doctrine, passed down through generations of infantry officers who had never heard of the Colmar Pocket but understood the principle. Attack when the enemy cannot see, move when they cannot hear. Be inside the wire before the first shot is fired. The German defensive doctrine that failed so completely in January 1945 also survived in modified form. NATO planners studied the same terrain, built the same kinds of fortifications, registered the same fields of fire. They added thermal imaging and motion sensors and night vision equipment that would have seemed like science fiction to the men shivering in dugouts along the Rhine. The fundamental assumption that prepared positions could channel attackers into kill zones remained unchanged. They acknowledged now that attackers might not cooperate. The MG-42 that never fired on the American approach was captured, catalogued, and shipped back to Aberdeen Proving Ground for analysis. It worked perfectly. The barrel showed no defects. The ammunition was properly stored. The sighting mechanism was precisely calibrated. Every component functioned exactly as designed. The weapon was not the problem. 34 Germans in a fortified position. 47 Americans in the snow, 3 hours of movement, 34 seconds of violence, 2 American dead, 23 Germans killed, 11 captured. The numbers say enough.